When spinning your own yarn and knitting it then, or weaving it, or crocheting it, it's a good idea to make your own little samples of the gauge you're getting. Now, I'm hand carding everything right now, but I may be able to borrow a drum carder. And if I'm able to do that, that's going to take a few of the knobbies out of my yarn. I may also still use my charka, which means the yarn will be more like this than a smoother yarn. My spindle gives me a slightly smoother yarn. So depending on how you're spinning, your gauge may change. Now this, if you want to make, these are a little bit wide, but here's an example. This is 64 stitches on size 4 needles and knit 2, purl 2 for 4 inches. And that gives you a cuff. Now this was going to be a sock, but I found a yarn that is made in the United States of imported materials that will be better for like nursing home veterans and washing and labeling and things like that. So this was going to be a sock, but now it's a cuff, and I'm knitting a matching cuff. And these are wonderful, even if they're your test gauge items, because you can then use them to either sew to socks, because this one's kind of wide. Like I have a pattern to make quilted booties. I could sew this to the top of them and just add a hand-spun wool accent. Or I could pick the stitches up here, either in crochet or knitting, and complete a sock down this way using this as the top. But it's a cuff that you could sew to a sweatshirt. It's 64 stitches, size 4 needles, and knit 2, purl 2. And this one is about 5 inches wide. So that's a little bit wide, considering how wide a cuff is. But if you cut that in half and did 32 stitches, then it'd be that wide. So you can find ways to, instead of knitting a whole sock, which would have taken a lot of yarn, by knitting a cuff like this, even if you know that 64 stitches is a little wide, it's a good way to keep a record of your spinning and your gauge in your knitting. Now this is how the same yarn, this was kind of the junky part of the yarn, but this is how it weaves. Both of them fluff up after washing. It's called fulling, and they fill in. So this actually looks thinner and lighter when you're knitting it, but then once it's washed, look at how it's filled in. So making a cuff is a wonderful way to make a test swatch for your knitting in different yarns. When I get the Navajo churro, and I'm going to get some Icelandic from my brother, when I get those wools and knit a similar cuff, I will then have samples of the different wools. It's the same as making a pair of socks and knowing, that this wool knits like this with a sock, except you don't have to knit the whole sock to know what the knitting looks like. So it's another thing to think about when you're spinning your own yarn.